So the last talk in this session will be given by Professor Asmita Mukherjee. She is currently a professor in the Department of Physics in IIT Bombay. She completed her PhD in Saha Institute of Nuclear Physics. She has also had associations with University of Darmstadt, University of Leiden, Regensburg University, and her interests are in QCD and spin physics. She will talk to us on Nucleon tomography in J, Psi, production and future electron colliders.
Good morning. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here on the occasion of 60th year of IMSC. So first time when I visited Mat Science was I think 1998 in a school organized by Rahul Basu for PhD students. So I was a PhD student at that time. So that was my first visit here. And since then I have visited here many times. Each visit was very pleasant as well as fruitful. In the later years, I have been interacting with Ravindran and his group on interesting topics, and I look forward to many such fruitful visits in the future. So today I will be talking about Nucleon tomography in Jepsai production at the future Electron-ion collider. So this is about the structure of nucleons which build the matter. In terms of quarks and gluons, this structure is still not understood it is still not understood, let's say, completely. So as we all know, matter is built by atoms. So if you look at matter, let's say in the length scale of 10 to the power minus 10 meters, you will see some atoms. At the center of the atoms, there's a nucleus, and then electrons orbit around it. But this is not the fundamental particles. The atoms are not fundamental particles, neither is the nucleus. So if you can look into the nucleus at a length scale, let's say 10 to the power minus 14 meters, you will see substructures in it. So nucleus is built from two types of other particles. These are called protons or neutrons, or collectively nucleons. Then if you probe further, let's say at 10 to the power minus 15 meters, you will see these protons and neutrons are also not fundamental point particles. They are built from even more tinier objects. These are called quarks. So the size of these quarks would be even less than 10 to the power minus 19 meters. So how would you really see such tiny objects? You don't see these tiny objects by really placing the matter under a very powerful microscope. When I am saying that it is 10 to the power minus 19 meters, it is a measure of the energy with which you have to probe matter. So we see these tiny structures by bombarding two beams of atoms or two beams of nucleons at high energy. I am going to discuss that soon. So various interesting questions come up in this case. One is that how are these quarks spread inside these nucleons? Do they interact with each other? Yes, now we know they interact with each other by exchange of particles called gluons. Then we know these nucleons, protons or neutrons, they have spin half. So how is this spin half of proton built from the spin and orbital angular momentum of these quarks and also gluons? If you somehow are able to see these protons or nucleons under a very powerful microscope, okay, so how will you see the spatial distribution of these quarks inside it? Is there some correlation between the spins of these quarks? Quarks are also spin half particles that we know. So is there some correlation between the spin and the transverse momentum of these quarks? So these are questions that we are trying to understand even now. So in order to see how really we want to probe or we want to find answers to such questions, let me tell you a bit more about these quarks and gluons. So as I said, we now know that the quarks interact with each other via exchange of gluons, and this coupling is denoted by alpha S. So quark-gluon interaction is called color gauge interaction, or QCD. Full form is quantum chromodynamics. It is also sometimes called strong interaction. This is one of the four fundamental interactions in nature. So why is it called strong interaction? So you can compare the lifetime of two particles, one decays by strong interaction. So lifetime of particle decaying by strong interaction would be 10 to the power minus 23 seconds, whereas lifetime of a particle decaying by electromagnetic interaction would be about 10 to the power minus 20 to 10 to the power minus 16 seconds. One thing is that this coupling alpha S is not constant. That is not a surprise because we know that QED coupling alpha is also not a constant. It changes with energy. So alpha S, the strong coupling, also changes with energy. This kind of change is called running of the coupling. But the striking point in QCD or strong interaction is that this running is completely different from the running in alpha, the QED coupling. The cause of this difference is that gluons interact with each other. Gluons carry colored charge, unlike photons in QED which do not carry electric charge. Photons do not interact with each other, but gluons interact with each other. As a result, we get diagrams in QCD not only like these where gluons form QQ bar loops, but also gluons form gluon loops. Okay. So due to this, the colored charge is screened both by virtual quarks and virtual gluons. So let us see these two graphs which shows the striking difference of the QED case as well as the QCD case. On the left hand side, I have shown the plot of alpha versus distance. So distance is inversely proportional to energy. So at large distance or at low energy, alpha is small, whereas at small distance or high energy, alpha is large. Okay. Whereas for the strong coupling alpha S, at large distance alpha S is large, and at small distance or high energy alpha S is small. So these cloud of virtual gluons carry colored charge, and as a result the effective color charge decreases. This is the reason why we have this strikingly different behavior of alpha S. So at low energy alpha S is large, that means one cannot use perturbation theory, because in these kind of high energy calculations one uses perturbation theory to calculate various things. So at smaller energies one cannot use perturbation theory, and quarks and gluons, they confine themselves to form hadrons. You cannot see free quarks and gluons. You will always see hadrons or nucleons. So nucleons are a kind of hadrons. Whereas at high energies, alpha S is small, and then one can use perturbation theory. In fact, at high energy, when you probe the particles at very, very high energy, you go inside the nucleon, there you can treat the quarks as almost free. Okay, so this is the striking difference between QED and QCD. So as I briefly mentioned, you don't see the matter by putting it under a very powerful microscope. When I say you see the substructure of the matter, means you put the matter, you bombard matters with each other, highly energetic beams of particles, and these particles break up, and from that process you try to see the substructure of these particles. How? That is the object of this talk. So let us consider highly energetic bombardment of electron and proton. Okay. So these kind of, so the electron gets bombarded with the proton and gets scattered, it gets deflected at a certain angle. So at very, very high energy, this breaks up the proton. So this is then called deeply inelastic scattering. The proton breaks up into its fundamental constituents, various quarks, and these quarks then again combine together and form different hadrons. So what happens at such a high energy is that there is a photon, sort of a photon coming from the electron that interacts with the quarks inside the nucleon. But this is not a real photon in the sense that this photon has a mass. So in particle physics, we call such photons virtual photons. It has a virtuality. The virtuality or the mass of the photon comes from the energy and momentum transferred in this process. Okay. So at very high level of virtuality, this photon interacts with the quarks and forms this final state. Okay, so in this field, energy is usually expressed in units of giga electron volts, where 1 giga electron volt is 1.609 into 10 to the power minus 10 joules. The kind of interaction that I am talking of takes place when the virtuality is of the order of a few hundred giga electron volts. Okay. So in this case, the probability of this lepton-proton interaction, which is also called the cross section, can be given as a product of two parts. One part Q of x gives the probability of finding a quark. So quarks, gluons, antiquarks are sometimes collectively called partons. So Q of x is the probability of finding a parton inside the nucleon with a definite momentum fraction x, and then the photon interacts with it. And then the other part is basically the cross section or probability of this electron quark interaction. So this cross section for the electron quark interaction can be calculated using perturbation theory. This is called the hard part of the interaction. Whereas the probability of finding a quark inside the nucleon carrying a definite momentum fraction cannot be calculated perturbatively. This is called parton distribution function or collinear parton distribution. So more about this collinear parton distribution. So what you are doing here is that you are bombarding highly energetic, let us say, electron with proton. So there will be Lorentz contraction. So in the direction of motion there will be Lorentz contraction, so proton will not be spherical anymore. It will be like a pancake in the transverse plane. And these quarks are scattered on this transverse plane. So at high energy I can treat these quarks as free. So that is initially what was done. So and also what you can do is that you can neglect the transverse motion of these quarks in this transverse plane, because it is such a highly energetic and it is moving very fast, let us say along the z direction. So these quarks are frozen in the transverse plane, and each of these quarks carry some different fractions x1, x2, x3 or so on of the total momentum of the proton. And that probability of picking up this particular quark with a definite momentum fraction x gives you the collinear parton distribution. It basically gives a one-dimensional description of this proton in terms of the quark. And these quantities parton distributions, as I said, are non-perturbative, and people extract it by fitting experimental data. Later we have seen that, later experiments have shown that these parton distributions not only depend on the momentum fraction x, but they also change with energy scale. They depend on the energy at which the proton is probed, that is the virtuality of the photon. So this is called the scale evolution of the parton distributions, variation of parton distributions with the energy scale. One advantage of this parton distribution or collinear parton distribution is that these are independent of the process. Once it is extracted by fitting data in one process, it can be used to predict cross section in another process as the scale evolution is known. Okay, that gives the predictive power of this kind of field. However, these collinear parton distributions that give sort of one-dimensional picture of the proton is not often enough. Sometimes in experiments you can try to see the polarization effects of your beams. Okay, we know how to prepare polarized beams, and people are actually doing it in experiments. Suppose you prepare a proton beam which is polarized in a plane transverse to the direction of motion. These are transversely polarized proton beams. Then what has been seen since many years, this is a plot from 1991 Fermilab experiment. The cross section of some processes depend on whether the polarization of the proton is up or down in the transverse plane. These two cross sections are not the same. Okay. So what is the reason? Why normally you would expect that the cross section would be the same because of rotational invariance or something, but they are not the same. So this gives rise to an asymmetry. The asymmetry is defined as the difference of these cross sections up and down divided by the unpolarized cross section. These are called single spin asymmetries. Only one of the beams is polarized. And these large asymmetries have been observed in experiments since many years. And it's large because it's about 30 to 40%. And these large asymmetries cannot be explained in terms of collinear parton distributions. So lots of theoretical studies had been done in this field in the past few decades, and it has been shown that in order to explain this kind of single spin asymmetries, one cannot neglect the transverse motion of these partons. Okay, you cannot really imagine that the partons are frozen on this pancake. They are actually moving on this pancake, and you have to take into account the effect of this transverse motion of these partons. So thus comes the concept of TMDs, or transverse momentum dependent parton distributions. So this gives the distribution of quarks or gluons or partons inside the proton, both in terms of the longitudinal momentum fraction x and transverse momentum kappa. Okay. And as we are going to see, there are different kinds of TMDs. There are several TMDs, each of these TMDs. So TMDs is a short form of transverse momentum dependent parton distributions, and they play a crucial role in the single spin asymmetries and in some of the azimuthal asymmetries. And different TMDs give a different physics insight into various questions that I listed on the first slide. So these kind of questions are being tried. We are trying to understand these kind of questions in different high energy collider experiments around the globe. So here I give list 4 of them. One is the Large Hadron Collider, or LHC, which is located in CERN, Geneva, Switzerland. This bombards highly energetic proton beams or also heavy ion beams with each other. Then this is a picture of the relativistic heavy ion collider, which is located at Brookhaven National Lab, Long Island, US. This also collides highly energetic proton beams or heavy ion beams. This is a picture of a fixed target experiment. Here we have one target that is fixed and it is bombarded by a highly energetic electron beam. This is the CBA facility at Jefferson Lab, Virginia, US. And this is a picture of Hera, Daisy Hera, which is located in Germany, Hamburg. So this completed its data taking in 2007. This was also an electron-proton collider. There is one more important collider coming up also in the US. This will bombard highly energetic electron beam with proton and heavy ion beams. This is the Future Electron-Ion Collider. So people interested in this field are currently looking forward to the start of operation of this collider. So I am representing the international scientific community in the steering committee of the users group of this collider, and we look forward to a very strong Indian participation both in theory as well as in experiment. At present 30 institutes from India are participating, are shown interest in the working of this upcoming collider. So this will be built at the Brookhaven National Lab, and this will collide highly energetic electron beam with proton or heavy ion, and it will basically take snapshots of the proton. So that is what is called tomography. By tomography I mean that we will take a two-dimensional many images of this internal structure of this proton, and from there we will get the three-dimensional picture of the proton. In particular, it will try to understand the glue that binds us all. Those are the gluons. So these quarks interact by gluon, and so we will try to understand particularly the gluons, and also we will try to understand how the spin half of the proton is made from the spin, and what is the spin of the quarks, and what is the role of the orbital angular momentum of the quarks and gluons. Also, it will explore the correlations between spin and orbital angular momentum as well as the intrinsic transverse momentum. So the object of this talk is to briefly discuss how it will do so in the context of one particular process. It will not probe only this process, it will do many other things, but I myself am interested in this particular process, and that is why I will give you a little bit more details on how this collider will probe the questions that I raised in this process. So let us consider a bit the theory of a process where we are observing a particular hadron in the final state in electron-proton collision. Okay. So we are bombarding highly energetic electron beam with proton beam. That is what that will be done at the electron-ion collider. And in the final state, we are observing this scattered electron. Not only that, we are observing some particular hadron, let us say Jebshai or something else, with a certain transverse momentum. We place the detector and we also observe this hadron. These kind of processes are called semi-inclusive deep inelastic scattering. So these TMDs play a very crucial role in some of the observables in this kind of semi-inclusive deep inelastic scattering, particularly the single spin asymmetries and asymmetries in the azimuthal angular distribution of this final hadron. Okay. So the cross section for these kind of processes can be written in terms of two parts as a product or convolution of two parts. As I said, one of these parts is the interaction of the electron with the quarks inside the nucleon. This is the perturbative part or the hard scattering part. Then there are these PDFs, parton distributions, which now are the transverse momentum dependent parton distribution. These will play a role here. And there are somewhat similar things in the final state because we are observing not the quarks but the final hadrons. So we also have to consider the probability that the quarks will combine with each other and form some hadrons. So these are the fragmentation functions. So these transverse momentum dependent parton distribution as well as fragmentation functions cannot be calculated in perturbation theory. Okay. Only this part, the hard part, can be calculated order by order in perturbation theory. Each of these parts depend on the scale of the interaction, and the scale dependence becomes smaller and smaller. So scale dependence gives you a theoretical uncertainty, and this can be reduced further and further by going to higher and higher order in this perturbation theory. Okay. So this is called generalized factorization, and this is really remarkable that at high energy these kind of cross sections can be factored into these parts. This gives a predictive power. Although I must say that this generalized factorization including intrinsic transverse momentum is not proven for all processes. One complication comes in here, as I said before, the predictive power comes because the collinear parton distributions which we are familiar with, they are independent of the process. So if we extract the collinear parton distribution in one process, then we can use the same parton distribution to predict the cross section in another process. The problem here is that when you incorporate the transverse momentum, that is not so. The TMD PDFs depend on the process. This process dependence of TMD PDF comes from the initial and final state interaction or the gauge link or Wilson line. So before I briefly discuss that, let me tell you what are the different TMD PDFs. As I said, there are several TMD PDFs. Each of these PDFs give different insights into the quark-gluon picture of the proton. So there are 8 TMD PDFs at leading twist or at leading level of 1 by q square for quarks. Okay. So these 3, so for example this F1, if we look for unpolarized quark inside unpolarized proton, then we have F1. If we look for longitudinally polarized quark inside a longitudinally polarized proton, we will have G1. If we look for transversely polarized quark in a transversely polarized proton, we will have H1. Okay, so these 3 TMD PDFs are non-zero even if you integrate over transverse momentum, but not the others. Okay. Then several TMD PDFs have different properties, like some of them are odd under time reversal transformation, some of them are even under time reversal transformation. And there are different physics interpretation of all these TMDs. So in this talk, we will be talking about the Sieverts function TMD PDF, which is one of the 2 time reversal odd TMD PDFs. Okay. And the advantage is that each of these TMD PDFs not only gives different physics, but they contribute in experiment, they contribute in different manner. That is, they contribute in different azimuthal asymmetries in an experiment. That is why we can separate them. So to illustrate this different contribution, I will just show you, this is one of the few technical slides. I will show you the expression. If you calculate this cross section for this lepton-proton interaction, the semi-inclusive dipolaristic scattering, it will look like this. Here we have considered a transversely polarized proton. The proton is transversely polarized, and you calculate the cross section which is differential in the transverse momentum of the outgoing hadron as well as the transverse spin. This will have different kind of azimuthal modulations. You see all these cos phi h. Phi h is the azimuthal angle of the hadron you are observing, and then phi s is the azimuthal angle of the spin, transverse spin of the proton. There are different kinds of azimuthal modulations. And each of these azimuthal modulation term will come with a different coefficient. This, for example, comes with FUU cos phi, this is FUU cos 2 phi and so on. And these kind of coefficients will carry these TMD parton distribution and TMD fragmentation function. For example, since we are talking about Sieverts function TMD, this Sieverts function TMD will sit only in one particular azimuthal modulation. This is the sin phi h minus phi s term. Phi h is the same as phi. So if from this measurement one can somehow extract this sin phi h minus phi s modulation, we can get information on this Sieverts function if we know the fragmentation function, which is known by the way. Similarly, by extracting the cos 2 phi h modulation from the data, we can get information of some other TMD. Okay, that is what people are doing actually in these experiments, and theorists are also trying to gain insights into these questions by calculating these coefficients using models or parameterizations. I am a theorist, so that is what I am trying to do. Okay, so let me tell you a bit more on this particular TMD, Sievert's function. What is Sievert's function? So Sievert's function TMD was first proposed by Dennis Sievers in 1990. It is related to the probability to find an unpolarized quark inside a transversely polarized proton. Okay. In fact, there are many theoretical works in recent days. It has been found that it includes the correlation between the quark intrinsic transverse momentum and the transverse spin of the proton. That is the physics insight that it gives. In fact, in some model calculations, it has been shown to be related to the orbital angular momentum of the quarks inside the nucleon. Okay, so these quarks are not stationary, they are moving. So there should be some orbital angular momentum of the quarks as well as the gluons. So quark-Sievert's function in some models is related to the orbital angular momentum of the quarks. One interesting thing is that it is odd under time reversal transformation. But when you observe some effect of this, it must be time reversal even. So what happens is that it combines with another time reversal odd effect to give an observable asymmetry. And actually this was a matter of very strong debate in this field about 20 years back. In fact, Collins wrote a paper showing that the Sievert's function should be 0 because it comes from time reversal odd effect. But then Brodsky, Huang and Smith did a seminal calculation in a model and showed how it can be non-zero and how an observable effect can come. So this is the famous paper of Brodsky, Huang and Smith. So they did a simple calculation, not in QCD, but in some simple model which is also known as scalar diquark model. And they showed that Sievert's function can be non-zero, and the required other time reversal odd part is basically a phase factor which comes from the final state interaction, and it depends on proton spin polarization. So you have a process like this, so electron and proton scattering, it goes through this virtual photon. So this virtual photon interacts with one quark inside the nucleon, which is also called the active quark. Active quark is the one that participates in the interaction. But proton does not have one quark, it has many other quarks and gluons. These other quarks and gluons are collectively called spectators. They are not actively participating in the interaction, they are spectators. But these quark, the active quark, can have some interaction with these spectators via some exchange of gluons. So these in this process are the final state interaction. This is just a very simple diagram. There can be many gluon exchanges here. Okay, and this final state interaction here gives a very important phase that gives rise to non-zero Sievert's asymmetry. Okay. So after that, people have done extensive calculations in gauge theory, namely QCD, and they have shown that this is actually related to the gauge link or Wilson-9 contribution that is required for gauge invariance. So this has been a very active field in the past 20 years, or let's say 10 years. So as I said before, Sievert's function or TMDs, in particular the TMDs that are odd under time reversal, they are process dependent. They depend on the process in which they are probed. Let us consider two different kinds of process. One is the semi-inclusive deep inelastic scattering, that's what I have been discussing so far. There's another process which is called Drell-Yan process, where you bombard two proton beams and in the final state you observe a lepton pair, okay, like electron, positron or so on. So this is called a Drell-Yan process. And this gauge link or this kind of gluon exchange depends on specific process. In some process it can be a final state interaction like semi-inclusive deep inelastic scattering. In some process like Drell-Yan, it can be an initial state interaction. And the gauge link structure in these two processes are different. So this gives a very powerful prediction, theoretical prediction. Gauge link structure or Sievert's function in Drell-Yan process is same in magnitude but opposite in sign compared to the Sievert's function probed in semi-inclusive deep inelastic scattering, because of the particular nature of the gauge link in these two different processes. Among other things, this is one of the very interesting questions that we still need to understand experimentally. Initial results from the relativistic heavy ion collider indeed favors this kind of sign change, but more data is required here. So here the electron-ion collider, future electron-ion collider will play a very important role. Okay, let us come to the gluon-Sievers function. So far I was showing you quark TMDs, but there are also gluon TMDs. Okay, so there are both quarks, antiquarks and gluons inside the nucleon. So like quarks, one can also think of some gluon mediated interactions. Okay, and then we have to talk about gluon TMDs. Gluon-Sievers function is much less understood than quark-Sievers function. In fact, the process dependence of gluon-Sievers function is more involved, as gluon TMDs, I skip all the details, but gluon TMDs involves 2 gauge links or Wilson line compared to quark TMDs that have only 1 Wilson line. So here we discuss a process that probe the gluon-Sievers function at the EIC or electron-ion collider, which is Jepchai production in the EP collision, where we have a transversely polarized proton. In fact, there are some recent results from another experiment called COMPASS at CERN on gluon-Sievers function. It actually shows effect of non-zero gluon-Sievers function. So gluon-Sievers function is important and it plays a very important role for some processes. Now let us come to Jepchai. What is a Jepchai? So Jepchai is a particle. It is a bound state of one charm and anti-charm quark. Okay, these are heavy quarks. So it has mass 3.09 GeV by c square. It was discovered in 1974 by 2 experiments, one at SLAC, Stanford, and the other at Brookhaven. The production mechanism of this Jepchai particle, it is a bound state of these heavy quarks, it is a meson. Production mechanism is still not very well established. There are mainly 3 models or mechanisms in the market. One is called color evaporation model, one is called color singlet model, and the most widely used is based on non-relativistic QCD. And here one assumes a factorized form of the cross section, that is initial state quark or gluons forms a heavy quark pair, C bar pair, perturbatively, that is a hard process. And this C bar pair then emits some soft gluons, that is a non-perturbative process, and they form the bound state of the Jepchai particle. So this non-perturbative process is included in a non-perturbative matrix element, and this is called the long distance matrix elements or LDMEs. So these LDMEs are the non-perturbative part that can be extracted by data from various experiments, and the other part, that is where the quark or gluons forms the C bar pair, that is the hard part that people calculate in perturbation theory. Okay. And this heavy quark pair can be formed both in color singlet or in color octet states. So let us consider this particular process. Electron and transversely polarized proton, they bombard, and in the final state we are observing the scattered electron as well as a Jepchai particle. So I was talking about this semi-inclusive deep inelastic scattering with one observed hadron. Here my observed hadron is this Jepchai particle. So if you want to calculate this kind of cross section theoretically, at leading order you will get contribution from these 2 Feynman diagrams. These are the virtual photon interacting with gluon in the proton and giving rise to a C bar pair. These are the heavy quark pairs in the final state, and this C and C bar then later forms Jepchai through a non-perturbative process or LDMEs. So the amplitude can be written in this way, where this O mu nu comes from these Feynman diagrams, that is the hard or perturbative part. PSSZ is the spin projection operator that projects out spin triplet or spin singlet, and these are related to the non-perturbative part or the LDMEs.
So, a couple of more minutes. So,
yeah, sure. Okay, so from the diagram you can get the hard part that will look like this. And the theoretical estimates are arranged in double expansion in terms of a velocity parameter v. So NRQCD means that we associate a velocity parameter v which is assumed to be small with this process. So the theoretical predictions are arranged in a double expansion in terms of a velocity parameter v as well as the coupling alpha s. And these LDMEs, long distance matrix elements, they have different scaling behavior with respect to the velocity parameter v. Okay. In fact, here for our relevance only the color octet formation is important, because as was shown in this paper, single spin asymmetry can be non-zero in EP collision if the heavy quark pair is formed in the color octet state. So as I don't have much time, let me skip all these things. So these are a few details of calculations of this cross section or the asymmetry. So here we are interested in calculating the particular azimuthal modulation that contains the Sievert's function. So what basically we do is that we calculate the numerator and denominator of this particular azimuthal modulation, and when we integrate over phi, all the other azimuthal modulations go away. And so in that case we extract the contribution of only the Sievert's function theoretically. That is the aim. And the coefficients of this Sievert's function comes from these diagrams as well as the LDMEs. As I said before, several LDMEs will contribute to this single observable, as the C bar pair can be produced in various states, and then it emits the soft gluon and becomes a Jebshai. So let me skip this also. Okay. Also, to make a theoretical estimate of the Sievert's asymmetry, one has to make some models or parameterizations of the TMDs. The TMDs are not known, that is what we are trying to probe in this experiment. However, for theoretical predictions, we have to take help of some model or parameterizations. So there are several models of parameterizations of the Sievert's function TMDs. In most models, the intrinsic transverse momentum dependence of these quarks or gluons are taken as a Gaussian. Okay. So we use one particular parameterization that looks like this. The parameters of these models are obtained by fitting data. And the scale evolution or evolution of the TMDs with the energy scale is also known, that is different from the collinear parton distributions. So here I show some representative plot of this Sievert's asymmetry. This work was done in collaboration with my then student Rajesh. The asymmetry is negative, but you see, so different plots correspond to the different model or different parameterization of the gluon Sievert's function. What you see here is that there is a heavy dependence of the asymmetry, the magnitude as well as the sign on this parameterization or model dependence of this TMD Sievert's function. This is why we need more data for this process from the future electron-ion collider that will fix these discrepancies, okay, that will fix the model to a large extent. In fact, the existing data from the COMPASS collaboration has only 2 data points on this asymmetry with huge error bars. So here we plot these data points together with our prediction. Our prediction at leading order is only at z equal to 1. You see one such model falls within the error bar, but these results are not that conclusive. Not only this process, there are several other processes even including Jebshai production that can probe the gluon Sievert's function. Another process is inclusive production, photoproduction of Jebshai. Here the interaction goes through via a almost real photon, that is virtuality of the photon is very small. This involves contribution from higher level Feynman diagrams. So as you go to higher and higher levels, you get more and more diagrams. So contributions from all these things have to be incorporated, and you can calculate the asymmetry. This is from another reference together with my students Rajesh and Raj. And here again you see the effect of the different models of gluon TMD. It also depends whether you have a positive asymmetry or a negative asymmetry on the model. Okay. So these objects need better data in order to pinpoint whether what is exactly the parameterization of the gluon Sievert's function. One more process, okay, so here we have shown the plot of the cross section, not the asymmetry but the cross section for unpolarized process. The advantage is that for this process the data from the past collider Hera actually exists, and you can compare with those data, and you see that there is practically very good agreement with the Hera data, provided you include both the color singlet and color octet contributions of the heavy quark pair. And for example, one can also consider a back-to-back production of Jebshai and gluon jet that will also give have sensitivity to gluon Sievert's function. This is the plot of the asymmetry in this particular process, and you see significantly large asymmetry. contribution from quarks is very small. So this is another golden channel which will probe the gluon-Sievers function at the future electron-ion collider. This brings me to my summary. The upcoming electron-ion collider at BNL will give new insight into the fundamental building blocks of matter, in particular to the gluons that binds us all. It will probe the TMDs over a wide kinematical region and with high luminosity. What we discussed here is that theoretical predictions of some of the observables in heavy quark-onium production that can probe one of the particular TMD that is of interest, which is the gluon-Sievers function. This TMD gives the correlation between the intrinsic transverse motion of the gluons with the transverse spin of the proton, and it also is related or thought to be related to the orbital angular momentum of the gluons. Now when we talk of gluon-Sievers function, this can probe the orbital angular momentum of the gluons. And single spin and azimuthal asymmetries can give insight into this. Okay, so thus we can hope to get some Nucleon tomography in terms of gluons. I would like to end my talk with this picture, but before I came here I saw the same picture just outside this room. This is a picture from 2008 WEP that was organized here in IMSC. The convener was Rahul Basu, who is here, and quite a few of us can identify ourselves in this picture. And I could not find a picture of the 2000 WEP, by the way, and I saw that there are no pictures outside also. Thank you.
Thanks, Asmita. So we have a small memento for you.